appreciate your invitation. I appreciate your coming here today, this afternoon. And of course, I know you are beginning to feel a bit that spring is in the air. And to come out here on a Saturday afternoon takes some doing, and I certainly appreciate your taking the time. Of course, I think the subject matter warrants the time as well. Death at an early age. Is the school system setting our children up for failure? Is the topic that was suggested to me today, and to which I will speak for a bit. Is the school system setting our children up for failure? Very interesting question. Is the school system really has it ever set them up for anything else? It depends on how you measure failure and, of course, how you measure education.
In his powerful lecture, The Failure of the Education System, Dr. Amos N. Wilson critically examines whether the American educational system is intentionally structured to produce failure in Black children. He begins by challenging the audience to think deeply about the definitions of education and failure. Dr. Wilson argues that without a clear and functional understanding of these terms, we will continue to be manipulated by a system designed to keep Black people misinformed and disempowered. Rather than fostering the full human development of Black children, he asserts that the current system trains them to serve the interests of others while believing that academic achievement equals liberation. Dr. Wilson draws a compelling connection between education and welfare policy, emphasizing how both have been historically weaponized for political gain and social control. He exposes the myth of welfare by revealing how Black families, particularly Black women, are often falsely portrayed as its primary beneficiaries, when in fact the major recipients are white. This false narrative serves to stigmatize and police Black communities while masking the broader systematic issues. Welfare, he explains, has been used not as a support system, but as a mechanism to regulate the behavior of the poor, particularly Black families, dictating how they live, raise their children, and survive.
In my class at the College of New Rochelle at the campus here at Co-op City, I teach a course called Children at Risk. And during that course, we study an article from a very well-known book in the field called Regulating the Poor. That book describes how welfare policy in this country and how welfare policy historically has been used for political purposes, political and economic purposes. You know, if you hear people talk about welfare today, you would think that welfare was something that was invented in the United States and something that's principally utilized by African people, by Latino people. And we have built up such a mythology around welfare, the welfare mother, the welfare family, until it takes me a whole semester often just to knock out the myths surrounding the concept of welfare and what welfare is really about. There are many people, for instance, who still believe that there are more Black people or Latino people on welfare than there are white people. And it's an amazing game as to how the political structure of this country operates on that myth. And they confused often percentages with absolute numbers. So we would say that maybe 33 or a third of Black people are on welfare, and say maybe 15% of whites are on welfare. People confuse those two things. But when you're talking about 15% of whites, you're talking maybe about 9 million people, you see. as against even 30% blacks, you're talking about something like 5 million. In other words, then, you have 4 to 5 million more whites on welfare than blacks. Why is there a higher percentage of blacks on welfare? Because there are a higher percentage of poor black folk on welfare. It's no big mystery. If poverty is one of the things that qualifies one to receive welfare, then the group that have a higher percentage of poverty-stricken people will have a higher percentage of people there. It has little to do with the kind of stuff we hear every day about attitudes and people wanting to stay on to have babies and all that other kind of nonsense. As a matter of fact, when you actually look at the average number of children per welfare mother and compare them with the average number of children per mother not on welfare, I think you'd be quite surprised to find out that that average is not very different. You see, but myths are hard to put down. When we talk about welfare, you have to start in the 1600s, not in the 1900s, not in the 20th century. But in some place like 1605, 1650, and you have to start in Europe. Welfare in its present form essentially was shaped in the 1600s in France and England and Europe. So if you want to study the history of welfare, you don't study the history of black folk on welfare, you study the history of white folk on welfare, and you study the history of welfare in Europe and study it as it was translated to America to get rid of the mythologies. And one of the important things you study, if you study the history of welfare, is to look at its political function. Welfare was not and is not only designed to meet the needs of the poor. To a great extent, we find that welfare was designed to regulate the behavior of the poor and to regulate the economic system, so that when the economic system was going through, I'm speaking now in Europe, when Europe moved from what we call feudalism, or from where the great percentage of people were involved in farming and involved in agriculture and moving over into an industrial state, there was a great deal of what we call dislocation. That's people without jobs, people without homes, because there was a transition taking place between farm work and industrial work. And in that transition, many people lost their farms, they lost their roles on the farm, and unless industrial jobs were available, they literally were left to beg. Often, though, they just did not beg or walk around and beg people to feed them. They became dangerous. They would often protest. They would disturb the peace and cause various other civic disturbances. And it was at the point where the civic disturbances became intolerable that the state of France, England, the cities in France and so forth, decided then to establish what we call welfare programs. In other words, often the welfare programs were created and administered more to control the politics, more to control order, than actually to feed the poor or to meet the needs of the poor. Often welfare was extended during high periods of unemployment or during periods when the nature of the economy was moving from one level of technology to another level, when people then were unemployed and had to be retrained and re-educated in order to operate in the new level of technology. And therefore, welfare would be brought in to sort of to help them over the transition. But when the transition was over, welfare then would be reduced. So you would have an expansion or contraction of welfare, an expansion or contraction of help from the state related to the political nature of what was going on in the state. Essentially, then, the function of welfare was to regulate the behavior of the poor. They started getting too outrageous in their behavior. If they started to threaten law and order and so forth, then the dole was expanded. But at the point where law and order could be maintained by other means, the dole was contracted. Now, in a similar manner, then, we can look at education, and education sort of as a regulator of a social economic system. Education and educational opportunity as being expanded or contracted, depending upon the social and political situations a nation finds itself in. In other words, educational opportunity is not automatically expanded or automatically given to people just because it's morally right to do so. Education is under the control of a particular set of people or a particular class of people at all times. And that particular set or class of people or race of people expands and contracts educational opportunity according to its particular need or according to the need of the state. I often talk in my lectures about what I call European constants, those things that remain the same despite obvious changes. Now, when you look at the history of our relationship with Europeans, you will note that certain basic things have not changed, despite the fact that there appear to be apparent changes, or there appears to have been some progress, particularly in regard to us as African people. For instance, many of us would think in this day and age that we as an African people have a fundamentally different relationship with whites than what our slave great-grandparents had. There are many youngsters today, for instance, when we talk about slavery, will argue that we need no longer concern ourselves with slavery, that this occurred so many hundreds of years ago, and this is not the case today, and that this is really a fundamentally different world that we live in today than before. This is one of the extreme deceptions that we operate on. In a fundamental sense, very little has changed in our relationship to whites since the time we came here as slaves. Why did we come here as slaves? Our major reason for coming here as slaves, or for being bought here as slaves, was to serve the economic interests of white folk, to be their servants and to meet their needs, to live for them and not to live for ourselves. We, during slavery, and the education of black people began during slavery time, not after slavery, but at the very point of slavery. As we often say, the first on-the-job training for black people took place on the slave plantation. The first forms of being educated for a particular job took place on slave plantation. So how is our being trained for particular jobs today that are still owned by white folk really fundamentally different from our great slave grandparents being trained for jobs, again, owned by whom? White folk. How is it that you're going to school today to work for white folk is really any different from being trained on the plantation to work for white folk? Even though you think then that because you may be studying computer science today, or you may be studying to be a TV newscaster or something like that, even though you may think that's fundamentally different from the role that your great slave grandparents played, it is really not that different. Because as we've indicated, there were more differentiation between slaves than field hand and house servants. Slaves were also skilled people as well. Slaves were iron workers and carpenters and shipbuilders and what we call millwrights. They worked in factories. As a matter of fact, at the end of slavery, In many areas of the South and in this country, there were more skilled black workers than there were white workers. In other words, there were skilled people among slaves, and there were more slaves with skills than there were free white folk. So the idea then that you may be gaining some kind of skill that your parents did not have, or that your great slave grandparents did not have, does not mean that the fundamental relationship between you and whites today and the great slave great grandparents had and white people during slavery time has changed fundamentally at all. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the major function of the education of black people, whether we talk about education on the plantation, during slavery time, during Reconstruction, or we talk about education right now at this moment, the basic function of education is for African people to serve the interests of white folk, and for African people ultimately to find jobs working for white folk. That has not changed one bit. I don't care what kind of job you may be training for. I don't care where you may think you're going to be working. But in the end, the intention is that we still will be under the rulership of whites. In other words, then, education, just as we referred to welfare earlier, is used to a great extent to regulate the poor, to regulate subordinate people. And therefore, educational opportunity will be expanded or contracted depending on the need of those who rule over us. If at times they think that they need a larger number of us, they may expand so-called educational opportunity. If, though, the need for educated Africans has been reduced, then you will see a contraction taking place as well. I want you to recognize, for instance, that the issue of our dropping out of school is not the failure of people just to realize that they should stay in school. I argue that the dropping out of African people, African American students, serves a major political function in this system. In other words, our inability or our not completing school serve to maintain the stability, the political, economic, and social stability of the United States. And to test what I'm saying, you need to only ask yourself the question today: are jobs in New York City expanding or contracting? Are there more jobs available today than yesterday? You see, is the city closing down on number of jobs, or is it expanding the number of jobs? Are jobs leaving New York City, or are they coming into New York City? You see, in other words then, where are the opportunities for the increased number of students who will be graduating from New York City schools? In other words, ladies and gentlemen, you have to look at the fact that about 65% of the so-called better jobs in New York City are held by white folk. And yet, at the same time, the number of jobs that are available to both whites and blacks or any other group of people in New York City are shrinking. So New York City is faced with a dilemma. It's faced with a dilemma that says, if we educate a large number of people, where will we have the jobs for these people? And if you are one of those educated people, you've gone through 12 years of school, then gone through 4 more years of college education and so forth, and when you get out, you find that there are no jobs, you're going to find yourself in quite a temper. You're going to raise quite a bit of hell. You're going to protest. You're going to create disturbances. So then, in order to block these disturbances from occurring, it is in the city's interest that a large number of people drop out of school. So that when they drop out of school, they can now make the excuse that you're not working because you didn't finish school. Of course, you don't ask the question, would you really have had a job if I finished? But since we accept the idea that you have to finish school and have an education to work, as soon as one says, well, if you had finished, you would have been working, we're willing to then let it go at that. In other words, you can ask the question the other way. What would happen if we educated 80, 90, or 95% of Black students, of Latino students, who are the majority of the New York City population now, if we educated them in such a way that they could score as well or outscore white folk? Ultimately, then, that would mean that we as people would replace white folk in the New York City occupational structure. At this point, you would probably see some racism in this town that you thought did not exist. It would be at this point that blatant racism would rise again, to the point as it happened in the South, where people would say, well, I don't really care what kind of educational background you have and what kind of qualifications you have. This is a white man's job. And this is for white folks first. But you see, we don't have to get to that nasty scenario because we drop out before we what? Get there. So it saves the city and it saves the nation some very nasty racial confrontations. That is one of the reasons I argue then that this city and this nation, as much as it talks about preventing dropouts, as much as it talks about improving the educational quality of our children and of our people, never seems to be able to do anything about it. Never seems to be able to change anything. So we have a lot of bleeding hearts about how we wish and how we are trying to see to it that our people are educated and that the disadvantaged are educated, and you get great news pieces about some great teaching method or some great educational approach that can resolve educational problems, but then after a month or two you never hear of the great teaching approach again. In other words, then, we have to keep in mind that it is not in the cards, as far as Europeans are concerned, for African people to ever be their equals. As much conversation as you hear about equality and about, multiculturalism and all of the other stuff you hear floating in the air, the essential thing is that Europeans and whites have no intentions of moving African people from the positions of servitude, and they have no intentions of giving up their power to regulate our opportunity as a people and to regulate those opportunities in their own interest as a people. The other thing that we have to look at too is the fact that we as African people, we are a very moral people, you see. We are really moral. People talk about so-called criminality in the African community. But when you really look at us as a people, we tend to be very moral, and we tend to think that people should do the right thing just because it's right. And if people are in positions of responsibility, they should just take those responsibilities seriously and do and act toward those responsibilities in an equitable manner without regard to race, color, or creed. But this is not a reality at all. When you look at the reality of life, people belonging to different classes, people having different social, political, and economic power operate in their own class interests. No matter how moral it may be, and no matter how moral it may sound, there is no way that the Europeans who have the economic and political power and the advantages that they have today are going to voluntarily give them up to you as African people in the name of some kind of moral principle or in the name of Christianity. And I'm saying this because we think that professionals belonging to a particular ethnic group are going to overlook their ethnicity, that professionals belonging to a particular class background are going to overlook their class background, and that they are going to provide equal opportunity for others. You must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that class struggles and struggles between groups is a reality. You young people here today, I will assure you that by the time you get 80 or 90 years old, there will still be ethnic struggles. There will still be struggles between ethnic groups. Do not deceive yourself and do not fall for the propaganda that someday, some way, little white boys and little white girls are going to be holding hands and people are going to be measured by the content of their character. You got another thought coming. The struggles between races and groups, the struggles between classes and groups has been here since the very beginning, and they will continue to be here. The only people foolish enough to believe that such an age is going to come are black folk. And this is one of the reasons why today they're on the bottom of the class and economic and political ladders, because they actually believe somehow a miracle is going to occur where folk are going to look at them and not see the color of their skin. If you think that there's going to occur, you got another thought coming. If you're keeping up with the news today, if you're looking at what's going on in all over the world, in Yugoslavia, where you have so-called ethnic cleansing operations going on, where the Serbs are fighting against the Muslims and the Croats and so forth. If you look at this situation, here are people who lived under Russian communism for almost 40 years. And under Russian communism, they were taught the ideals of class, that there is really no difference in classes, that there should be no class differences, there should be no race differences, there should be no differences based on religion and so forth. And communism is about reducing differences based on class, religion, and creed. And the Russians ruled over Yugoslavia, ruled over Czechoslovakia, Armenia, and many other nations and brought them into what we call the Soviet Empire. Now, as soon as Russia fell apart, what happened? These groups fell into ethnic conflicts. And now you are reading and hearing about the ethnic conflicts that are going on in Herzegovina, in Sarajevo, in Yugoslavia. Even if we look today in our homeland of Africa, we will still see struggles within our African nations between ethnic groups. Ethnic struggles and class struggles are realities. And until we recognize that these are realities and they are realities that we have to confront and deal with, we will be victimized by the realities that we seek to deny. And to a great extent, the thrust of this country has been to get us as an African people to deny reality, has been to get our youth so caught up in music, and so caught up in clothes, and so caught up in wishful thinking, and so caught up in multiculturalism that they will not recognize the realities that are going on in the world. As I often tell college classes, you talk about multiculturalism in the classroom, and you're singing other group songs, and you're learning to respect other groups and other races. And I ask then, where are the multicultural grocery stores in your neighborhoods? Where are there blacks and Koreans owning the grocery stores? Where are there blacks and Koreans owning the vegetable markets? Where are there blacks and Latinos owning stores and businesses? Where are there blacks and Arabs owning? Where is the multiculturalism that you talk about so much in these schools and in these colleges in real life? When you walk out of these doors and you're taught by multicultural teachers, you're taught by white teachers, and you're taught by teachers from other ethnic groups, but when you walk out of that door, you see essentially one group of people, one group of ethnic people owning your neighborhood. owning your vegetable markets, owning your businesses, controlling your community economically. So the reality of the school is not the reality of the world. The glorious sounds of Martin Luther King's speeches are not the realities of the world. And you must come to terms with the realities of the world. And the music that you hear and the hip hop and the sadistic rhymes that you hear in this rap is not the reality of the world. The recordings of pieces of Malcolm X's speeches between rap rhymes does not meet what you need to know about what's going on in the world. They are designed to maintain you deaf, dumb, and blind to reality, and ultimately to set you up for death and damnation and rulership by other ethnic groups and other people. You may dip and bow your head to the rhythm of the music. But yet, as soon as you dip and bow your head to the rhythm of the music, I can see you looking and looking to see if you can jump over the turnstile to avoid being caught by a white policeman. Because the reality is that while you're dipping and bowing to the sounds of the rap, the white nerds are staying in school, and the same white nerds will be the ones that will arrest you and put you in jail. And it's the same white nerds that you try to avoid at these turnstiles, and it's the same white nerds that sit in these courts and sentence you to 25 years in prison and sentence you to life in prison, and may one day even sentence you to death. You must wake up to the reality of things, and you must wake up to the fact that there is no group of people, white, black, Korean, Latino, Arab, or any other group, that's going to hand you and you and you and you equality on a platter. You're going to have to fight for it. You're going to have to struggle for it. And you're going to have to realize that you have to defend your interests as a people and as a student. And that there are classes today, such as the white middle class, that struggles to maintain.
Similarly, the educational system functions as a behavioral management tool. According to Dr. Wilson, education is not a neutral or benevolent force. It is directed and controlled by a ruling class that works solely in its self-interest. This class constructs an educational system that trains black students to not think critically or solve problems within their communities, but to assimilate and serve the dominant white society. Underfunded schools in black neighborhoods and a lack of critical resources are not accidental, but part of a larger design to limit the potential of black youth and maintain racial hierarchies. Dr. Wilson also explores the psychological effects of this system, particularly the misguided belief that success in education automatically translates into acceptance or equality. Many black people are led to believe that climbing the academic ladder will help them gain favor with the white society. But Dr. Wilson reminds us that this is an illusion. Academic credentials do not shield black people from systematic racism or economic exploitation. Instead, they are often used to reinforce the system that exploits black labor and intellect for the benefit of others. Finally, Dr. Wilson roots his critique in historical context, reminding us that the miseducation of black Americans began on the slave plantations. Black people were not brought to America to be educated or empowered. They were brought to provide labor. The current educational system, he argues, is merely a continuation of that purpose. It does not aim to produce independent thinkers or builders of black institutions. Rather, it trains black people to maintain the status quo. For true liberation, Dr. Wilson calls for a reimagining of education, one that equips black children with the tools to solve their problems, uplift their communities, and reclaim control over their destiny.